Again, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the second part of a three-part webinar series that we're so pleased to present. You've joined ISBM and you joined Professor Bernie Jaworski. We are now in part 2 of Creating the Organization of the Future, and they're going to talk about culture and values today. And we really hope for a great dialogue and discussion about this. Bernie is one of our fellows, and he's the Peter Drucker Chair in Management and Liberal Arts at Claremont Graduate University. And again, we're so grateful for him to join us. He tells me that his book has just published, and so we'll talk a little bit about how you can get that. I'll repeat it several times, but let me move on to the next slide here. So there I am, and there's Bernie, and you'll be hearing from him today. And you've joined ISBM, which is the Institute for the Study of Business Markets. We've been around for 40 years, founded in 1982, and we are the only institute that's solely devoted to B2B. We fund B2B research, our members help us with that funding, and we disseminate our knowledge to our membership and to others too, through things like our webinars here. We're a community of member companies and partner firms, along with our academic fellows that do research and our academic researchers. We have a long list of distinguished research fellows. I invite you to our website to learn more about each of them. We have 32 research fellows. We have a community of member companies, and here is a sampling of their logos. And we have partner firms and practice fellows that bring our education and consulting to our membership. Our leadership team is divided into two pieces. So on the left, you'll see Stefan, who heads up our academic side. And on the right is Rand and Lynn that do the member-facing functions. And Lori is in the center because she does everything for all of us. I'll remind you, in addition to getting Bernie's book today, if you're a member company and you'd like a copy of Business to Business Marketing Handbook, it's the just released second edition. Just send an email, respond to the chat window, send us a note some fashion and say, please send it to an address that the post office will deliver to. That's been a bit of a challenge, but we'll be happy to send you a free copy if you're a member company. If you're a member company, you also have access to B2B Pulse, which is everything that we know and everything we've ever produced. And you can search that and download it and share it with your teams and in your company. And if you'd like to understand more about this and you're not a member, we'd love to hear about that from you. And we'd be happy to chat with you and give you a sample of that to take a look at. Coming up next, we're going to have another webinar, the third in the series from Bernie, in September 12th. And in that particular one, he's going to teach us how to use what he's been showing us in the book. So I think you're going to want to take a look at these two webinars. You might want to actually get a copy of the book and read it, and then come along on the journey in September to learn how to use it. The other big thing that's coming up this fall is September 26 or 28 is our next members meeting. The focus is on how AI affects us in B2B. We've got some amazing presenters who have been working in this space for a while and have also been consulting in the B2B space. So I think you're going to really find that. Chris Penn's going to talk to us a lot about ChatGPT and those other tools that might, I don't want to say replace, but they might replace some of our staff, because we can now produce content fairly easily. Whether it's accurate is a whole nother story, but it's there. We'll also have our Marketing Excellence Roundtable on September 28th. For either of those, if you're a member, please go to the website and register. We'd like to know you're coming. It's in Chicago. And then October 5th and 6th is one more of our classes, which is the concept of value in B2B and developing winning value propositions. And that is a great course that's taught by Ralph Oliva, our previous executive director. Okay, we always have these questions. So yes, if you want to get a copy of this, it will come to you. If you want to have the slides from this, they will come to you. And all you need to do is wait for that if you've registered with your own email address. And if you're using somebody else's email address, then nope, that's going to go somewhere else. So do send a note to Lori and she'll make sure that you get a copy of it. We'd love for you to interact in real time in this particular presentation. So if you've got a question, you can go down to the Q&A or you can go into the chat. I'll be monitoring both of those while Bernie's talking. I'll interrupt him at any time that you send us a note and say, I have a question. And we'd love to, again, have the interaction. Bernie's going to ask us some questions too, so you should be prepared. If you've got to run and get a coffee, come on back. because there'll be some times when we'll ask you to participate back to us and give us some answers that we might want from you. Okay, if you want to follow up, we'll put this slide up again later, but there's Bernie's email address. Feel free to reach out directly, or Lynn, Rand, and Lori over here at ISBM will be happy to help you out. I'm going to then thank you and stop sharing, and I'll let Bernie come on in and share his slides.
Great, thank you. Let's see if this works here. It's always the dangerous period of the program when you pull up your slides and you say, gee whiz, do my slides appear? And the answer is they did. Hooray, we are 90% of the way there.
Right.
You know, it's interesting on ChatGPT, one of the fun things you do, as they say, there's a ghost portion of the ChatGPT. And one time I typed in, I said, who is Bernie Jaworski? You know, who is that person? And it came back with like 3 or 4 paragraphs that were just outstanding. The interesting thing is that I'm at the University of New Zealand, which I didn't know. I thought I was at Claremont, but apparently I'm at the University. Everything else was accurate, but the one small point here is that apparently I'm at the University of New Zealand, which might be surprising folks at Claremont. On the other hand, they're going to save some money because I don't have to pay my compensation since I'm at New Zealand. So that's probably the good news here. So listen, we have a very small group of folks that are with us today. And so that means we can be very intimate. We're going to call this the fireside chat portion of the program. For those of you who have no idea what I just said, this is Franklin Roosevelt back in the 1940s, used to comfort the United States by doing what was called the fireside chat, where people would crowd next to the radio and you take them through developments in the country. This is particularly during World War II. And so it became a very kind of a close bonding and fireside chat intimacy in terms of what he's trying to do to not only make the country more comfortable, but to also kind of connect with them, you know, in a very specific one-to-one way. So with our group today, I don't think we need to worry too much about shouting and screaming. We can kind of just jump into the chat or just raise your hand, and Lori will open it up for you to be unmuted and so forth. So I want to make sure that we are in a small group setting today, and everybody kind of understands the context. This slide I showed last time that we got together, I'm sure you guys have memorized it and thought very deeply about it. But the basic idea here is why write the book, and what's the point here? You know, Drucker has a very strong point of view that mission statements are ones that you need to look at on a regular basis. Your vision, your purpose, what business are we in? He believes that a major cause of business failure is lack of understanding what business you're in. And in his book, Managing Results, which I just reread this past week, he makes this very strong point of view that you need to be looking at this thing on a regular basis. And as I noted probably last time, he believes every firm should do an offsite every 3 years where they say, if we're starting the business all over again today, knowing what we now know, what should we do? And so even though we think of mission as being sort of really, you know, solidified and kind of really giving us direction, it is something that is what he called the theory of the business. If the industry context and the broad environment changes, like ChatGPT, making big pressure on what's unfolding, then you need to really be thinking carefully about the mission, vision, and purpose. And so last time we did a deep dive on these 3 concepts. The slide deck is up there. The talk is up there. The book is now published, so you can kind of take a look at it. Each of these chapters is very short. It's like 15 pages. It's written for you guys. It's not written for an academic audience. And it's intended to be incredibly practical and useful. And again, the unit of analysis can be your function, your group, your geographic area. Doesn't have to be the overall company. It can be. So today, what we're going to talk about is values and culture. And for those of you who've studied culture, you know, culture is broadly the norms, the belief, the practices, the artifacts, and the culture and the values of the company. But we're separating out values as a distinct part of culture because we think it's such an important part of what organizations do. And then we're going to deep dive into culture more generally. Okay, so that's the way the flow is going to unfold. Next time we get together, I am going to take you through the process to actually think about reimagining your mission, vision, and purpose, and reimagining your culture and values. Rarely firms start from scratch. They do. Virginia and I have done work for a very, very large pharmaceutical life science company where they were starting up an entire new area. They were one of those companies that grew from 0 sales to 20 billion over a short period of time. So one major group did not have a mission, vision, and purpose. So we did start from scratch, but oftentimes you're revising it. And that's typically the case. So we'll talk about the process for doing this. And it's going to be different for mission, vision, purpose as it is for values and culture. And I'll talk about that. And I'll tease you with that particular idea for next time that we get together. Okay. All right. So let's get into the content for today. What are the values? What are values trying to do? Values are important boundaries for how we ideally operate. When organizations come up with the values, you like to think they're a combination of what we're currently doing now and how we want people to ideally operate. But we're really saying this is how we should operate. This is the ideal world. This is what we want to see. Do we see it all the time? Not necessarily. And that's when you have interesting conversations around when there's a disconnect between, for example, someone who may be a very high performer, but not living the values. And what does that mean, right? But values then perform the guardrails. You know, in the best of all worlds, organizations don't need a lot of procedures, process, workflow, operations. If you have values and culture that set the guardrails and you give people, knowledge workers, lots of discretion, you may be able to get the behaviors that you want and the outcomes you want, the results you want. In fact, you know, that's really Drucker-esque, meaning that you want to give the knowledge worker as much control over how they do the work. You want to establish the targets and give them freedom to achieve them. It's a very Drucker-esque idea. Values are consistent with that. Set up the values. If I live the values and work the values, it's one important guardrail for keeping me focused in terms of what results I should be producing and how I should be producing those results. So there's 6 criteria that Virginia and I have identified as important as we think about value statements. One is they have to be meaningful to the population, meaningful to the employees. I read our value statement and I think, wow, that's an organization that really speaks to me and speaks to my values, speaks to my orientation. I would love to be part of an organization that has those types of values. Second is they're easy to understand. Why make this complex? Let's make this kind of understandable. The reason it needs to be really understandable is that everybody in the organization needs to live the values up and down the hierarchy. When you have 50,000 employees, everybody needs to understand them and be able to have behaviors that are consistent with them. They can't be complex, right? Particularly as you look at a global organization, English as your second language, these nuances around vocabulary are very, very important. So easy to understand. Typically, what Virginia and I observed is there's some combination in the values. So typically firms will have 6 to 10 values, right, as a rule. And some of those values are sort of we call must-have, and some of them are firm specific, right? So a must-have value could be things like integrity, right? Who doesn't want integrity? In fact, a must-have value could even be customer-centeredness. Who doesn't want to be customer-centered, right? But then you want to look at things that are firm specific. You want to be able to read a value statement and map that against who that company is, and to see how that company comes to life through their values. It should be connected to specific behaviors because everybody needs to be translating those values into their specific behaviors. They may need some help from their immediate sphere and how that works, but there should be a one-to-one correspondence between values and behaviors. The more specific they are, the better. So customer centricity, that's about, what does that mean in our world of life sciences? That means it's about the patient that comes first. Well, that's a very profound value because it means you're going to make trade-offs, demonstrable trade-offs when you put patients first and shareholders second, right? Patients quote come first, right? So specificity is very important. And finally, the value should support our strategy of who we are, right? So if you're in a slow-moving industry that's all about scale and all about operational efficiency, one set of values. If you're in an industry that's moving incredibly fast, where every 12 months there's a different business in a sense that needs to be put in place, all of a sudden agility, flexibility, the ability to pivot and operational excellence is not something you want. That may get in the way of your productivity, right? So point being, values need to match the overall strategy. So those are the 6 criteria we're going to use to evaluate. And what I want to do now is I want to go through a couple examples and see how people think about it. So Edward Jones, we've been very fortunate at the Drucker School to be working with Edward Jones over about a 40-year period. I started to work with him about 10 years ago. And Jones is somebody, the reason they're up here is there's some values here that you might think are kind of obvious, but Jones takes these very, very seriously. So when I'm in a room with them and I say, really, honestly, do clients always come first? Really? Violence could break out. I mean, it's really, they take it, they say absolutely. And here's 87 stories of how that happens, right? Quality long-term investment. They have the longest period of investment of their clients relative to any other investment firm. Last time I looked at it was like 13.5 years on average for an investment. They're the only partnership in the US market. So this partnership model is very, very important. Oftentimes we'll ask them the question of, if you were going to be selling a firm at a multiple of 5x, would you sell it? And they typically say no, because we're a partnership. And that's what Ted Jones wanted us to be back in the 70s and 80s when he gave the firm to the partners. And that's the way it has to be. We're going to be a partnership, right? And then individuals and their contribution, their values and respect. It's a very respectful organization. They still have debate. They still debate issues seriously, but it's an incredibly respectful type of organization. So here we see we have must-have values. Clients' interests come first. And then they have specific firm-specific ones, like working in a partnership. And then this notion of the strategy has a number of different trade-offs related to, we're going to do long-term investment, we're not going to do short-term investments. It's all going to be long-term. So not going to do any day trading. You're not going to have a technology platform to allow them to do day trading or even trading the way you would with Fidelity, the way you would with Schwab. You can't do that with Jones. You have to go through a individual who's going to guide you through. That is the financial advisor, and they're going to guide you through the decisions. So you can't self-serve. And so a lot of decisions they make are trade-offs related to how they go about doing that and have that particular connection. It's very conservative. They're focused on individuals and families. They're not focused on institutional investors and so forth. So very, very, very successful partnership over a 50-year period. And they've typically been best places to work, typically been really happy customers, typically the most well-paid financial advisors and the happiest and so forth. So really great example of a company that's really values-led. Now, let me show you one other example, and then I'm going to open the floor for a bit of a conversation with you. So Patagonia at some level is cheating a little bit because they're obviously somebody who's very sort of a purpose-driven, probably the most well-known purpose-driven company, and very much concerned about kind of the environment and using resources to address the issue of climate change, right? And so they're very focused on making sure that they're aiding and helping the planet survive. So yeah, they want to build the best product, but at the same time, they don't want to do any harm to the environment in which they're operating in. And they want to use their business, their perspective on how to actually protect nature and protect the climate. And the idea of not being bound by convention, the idea of being open and innovative in the best sense of the word, and also practice abandonment, which is a difficult thing to do. So they're meaningful, they're easy to understand. You can easily translate them into the nature of the work that we do. Some of these are must-have, meaning they're kind of not that novel. Build the best products. Who doesn't want to do that, right? That's kind of kind of got that. But the idea of no necessary harm, or the idea of taking these values and translating back to their purpose, that is to save the planet, that's kind of very, very novel, right? So each value gives an explanation, right? So they start talking about the behaviors they want to see, and they do this in the context of making it very explicit to their employees and other people that are stakeholders within the organization, investors and so forth, to understand what these values actually translate into. So use business, protect nature. It faces, our society needs leadership to kind of protect that. And then they embrace this, and they act to protect and restore stability, integrity, and so forth. So they're very concrete about how it is they think about what it means to actually engage in this type of values and the set of behaviors that support them. Okay. So those are two examples. Those are the 6 criteria. What I want to do right now is I want to pause for a second, because I'm going to ask you I'm going to skip over Intel, and I'm going to pause and ask you to evaluate a particular statement about how you score. But before I go there, before I ask you to score this particular statement, let me ask you, do you buy into these criteria? These criteria make sense for you. Is there anything missing from your perspective before I ask you to evaluate your own organization along these dimensions? So I'm going to pause here to see if we have anything showing up here in the chat room.
No, we don't have anything that anybody's said directly to us, but I do encourage, because we do have a small group there, Bernie.
Yep.
This is private consulting here, so come on in and let us talk about it. I found the Patagonia one very interesting, Bernie.
Yeah.
Like those phrases of like, okay, do no harm. That's okay. That doesn't. I feel like I can still make money and not do any harm, but use the business for nature, right? And I can't remember the exact same for the last one.
Yeah.
Both of those were, while not contradictory to being profitable, seemed like such a big statement around, we will choose to do things that may not be optimization of money, that's fascinating.
So this is where, when I'm with Edward Jones, we try to have these conversations, and I'm just using Jones as the example. You can do it with any organization. There's going to be situations where people are going to violate the values at some point. And so you say to them, is it okay to violate a value at this point or not? So let's take a concrete one, because Patagonia is a great illustration of this. But let's just take a life science company where they have they say we put patients first, and a lot of life science companies will say this. There's some form of this. We always put patients first. Okay, great. If you do that, anybody can say that, particularly if you're making a ton of money. Give me an example where you put patients first and you put shareholders second. Give me an example, because otherwise the values don't make any sense. I mean, So that's the interesting conversation. So the interesting one here, Lynn, would be there's something called orphan drugs. Orphan drugs are typically drugs that even the best case scenario is going to make 50 million a year, maybe. So for a big pharma company, the economics just don't clear, So what do you do? Or do you do the clinical trials and you take that drug to market? And well, if you're putting patients first and you've got the discovery that can help these patients, you're going to do the orphan drug. Now, do you do the orphan drug where you work in partnership with someone else and you mitigate risk? Do you do the orphan drug where you take it to market and then sell it? So, different ways to do this, but you've got to do the orphan drug if you've got the drug discovery, right? So the real interesting tension, and go back to the planet. Give me an example where Patagonia has done things to actually really save the planet, but really negatively impacted shareholder value, right? Or negatively impacted customer satisfaction because they put together a product that was not as durable as they had before because they used whatever, right? Those are, or costs went way up on the product. So the customer is unhappy, but they had the best, most sustainable product, right? Give me some of these examples and let's talk about those, because that's when the rubber hits the road around values, and that's the exciting conversation to have. And, quite frankly, everything needs to be tested, right? So values can be violated, right? I mean, there's certain ones, okay, integrity, maybe difficult to think about that one, but other ones that you have, we want teamwork. Well, if you're in crisis mode and you got to get something done and there's an urgency, do you really want teamwork, or does someone just step in and kind of take the drive, So these are the really interesting conversations I think to have. And by the way, I'm talking about them in general, but I know we're talking here in B2B and a lot of the stuff is around marketing. Same issues apply, right? It's the same issues, living the values in the world of B2B and living in the context of kind of what we're doing, right? And so what does that sort of look like? Here's an interesting one for B2B companies. Who do you put first? Are you putting first your customers that are writing the checks for you, or are you putting the end consumer first? Who goes first, right? That's so, you're the ingredient chemical supplier to a downstream end user, right? Well, is everybody equally valued, or is someone more equally valued, or what does that look like? And when do you have a trade-off? When you're doing something that's in your customer's best interest, but not in the consumer's, or conversely, the end consumer's best interest, but not, your client's best interest? Or equally important, when are we doing something that maybe is in the client's best interest and the consumer's best interest, but it's not in society's best interest, So, right. So these are when you have good conversations around values, right? So with that, I think we may have something coming up in the chat room here. For some reason, I can't access that, but maybe you can, Lynn, do we have something in the chat room, or am I missing it?
Lori is making sure people can figure out how to buy your book. That's what she's doing.
That's even more important. Let me pause there. Let me pause for a moment here to have everybody understand that if Lori's put the link in, then I just want to pause here and stop and call it a day. So let's do the
So Kelly has put a question in. You mentioned values should be unique. In our company, the values are who we are. However, we're not really looking at the competitors' values to compare to. So how do you balance uniqueness versus just focusing on who you are and your company values?
Yeah, it's a great question. So values, so you might say, well, why don't we just worry about ourselves and not worry about competition? Let's just worry about who we are, because it's about our community and making sure our community works. And just make sure we have the right community. Okay, so that could be the dynamic that's there, and that could be incredibly customer focused. So you think about the end customer, you think about crafting your values, and you're like, I'm fine. But another way to think about this is from the standpoint of talent management and recruiting the right talent in. If your values are the exact same as another competitor, then if talent's going to join you, who do they join? Just purely from a values perspective, not from a compensation or whatever. If on the other hand, you have a value in there that says something that speaks to you, we are a family-oriented environment, right? So there's a lot of companies that say they're very family-oriented. Netflix says that's the last thing we want to do. We are not a family, and we never will be a family, right? So now I get to make a choice. Do I want to work for a company that's not family-oriented and is very kind of sports team-oriented? That's their metaphor. Or do I want to be in a family nurturing, environment, right? That's important. So I would argue that from a competitive dynamic perspective, you want to take a look at others' values from the standpoint of talent management, acquisition, retention. And so that's one variable that becomes important. Now, there's others also, but I would encourage you to think that way as a way to think about where our values are and why we need to be somewhat unique. Now, can our values be very similar to competition, but there's one or two that are different? Yeah, and that may be enough, right? It's a good question.
Great.
Okay.
Okay.
Let me just do a quick poll here and just see what comes up here out of people scoring themselves here. And I know we have Kelly with us, and for some reason I'm having difficulty getting my here's my participant button. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we have Ron, Diana, and Kelly. So it's a smaller group here, folks. But I'm curious if they entered stuff into the chat room as to where they might score themselves. That might be a little bit helpful. Oh, sorry. Okay. All right. Well, let me do this. Think about this. By the way, this is a direct quote from Peter Drucker. A human body needs, belief that employees live by values. Animated belief that organization needs values as a human body needs vitamins and minerals. This is Drucker, right? This is Drucker back in the 1950s. Right. It's how we nourish ourselves. It's how we take care of ourselves, how we make sure that we're a healthy organization. Okay. All right. All good stuff. Let me, in the interest of time and the interest of having breakfast at some point this morning, move on to the next slide. So culture. Culture is, there's 87 definitions of culture, right? So culture is, if you look at definitions, you're going to see it's about beliefs. It's about values, which is important. It's about behaviors. It's about how we work here. It's about norms, right? It's about the unhidden, iceberg of what actually happens, that actually we say certain things, but what is really kind of going on, right? It also is interesting enough is it's something that actually has worked. The reason cultures exist is that they work. Now, cultures may need to change. We're always in situations where we're working with client organizations where they say our culture needs to change. That's a tough one, right? But the way to think about it is that if you really want to figure out how things actually unfold around here, how things actually get done, how does work actually get done around here? How do we, what behaviors actually get rewarded? What are the norms for how we interact in meetings? These are all cultural elements. And so here we tend to think about, there's 6 key criteria to think about your culture. One is, I'm not going to use the word good or bad culture. I don't like those terms, good or bad culture. I don't want to use those terms. I want to use the term strong culture and weak culture. So strong culture is one where the culture is very evident inside of that organization. You can go in and you can feel it. You can be there for a week and you can say, I can feel the culture. I get the norms. I get the behavior patterns. I get how people work around here. Very strong culture. I'll withhold judgment as to whether that's a good or bad culture, right? Because everybody has to make a determination as to whether it's a good or bad fit for them. So the first point here is the culture, if it's choiceful, it's not for everyone. It's a great fit for one segment and a terrible fit for another segment. There's one credit union in Northern California where the CEO talks to every single employee that actually they're going to hire potentially. And he says to them, this is either going to be the best company you ever worked for or the worst company you ever worked for. That's an example of somebody who has a very strong culture, because how they behave, how they orient what they do is so deeply embedded in terms of how it is they run that particular organization. It reflects how the company believes they're going to succeed and why. So we're going to succeed because we're family oriented, or we're going to succeed because it's teamwork and individuals that we're trying to excel. Cultures need to be tied to specific behaviors and expectations, right? They just can't be in general. We got to see the behavioral manifestation of that and try to make those explicit. When you tell someone about the culture of the organization, you can actually imagine, once someone says, here are the 7 or 8 elements of our culture, you can say, I could see what it would be like to work for that company. It's very evident to me what that could be like on a daily basis. There are points of tensions that are raised in different cultural elements. It's raised, it's articulated, it's known. So not every culture is one that all the elements fit together perfectly all the time. There may be some points of disconnect or some points of tension given different pressures on the organization. So we need to be able to articulate those and discuss those. And cultures take specific bets, right? They make a choice around whether they're going to be family culture, whether we're going to be a sports team culture, okay? So let's take a look at a couple of cultures that we think are ones that are kind of well known. So Netflix right now, over the last 12 to 18 months, has gone through a really turbulent time, right? There's all kinds of issues related to Netflix as we speak. And there's a lot of pressure on that particular organization. But the reason they're in here is they are the prototype of an organization that has a very strong culture. Now, is it a good culture or a bad culture? Not for me to decide, but it's a very strong culture. And so let's just take a look at some of the elements to why I'm saying they're a strong culture. So high performance, great workplace, stunning colleagues. We're like a pro sports team, not a family. We don't measure people how many hours they work or how much they're in the office. It's all about results, okay? Freedom. Our models increase employee freedom as we grow rather than limit it, right? So we have a situation where we want people to actually take responsibility, and we give people lots of responsibility. We don't want to micromanage. We don't want to control them. We don't want to have lots of meetings. We don't want to do check-ins. We don't want to do progress reports. None of that stuff. Just deliver the results and we're fine, right? The other thing correlated with that is we want to develop people by giving them opportunities to develop themselves, surrounding them with great colleagues, right? They don't do career planning, right? Which is kind of interesting, right? So it's up to the individual to make those choices, right? They pay it at the top of the market. They pay 1.5 to 2x salaries because they're thinking they get a lot more out of one incredibly high performing individual than 2 individuals that are medium performers, right? And so managers also set context. They're not overly directive. They're not trying to control their people. They're trying to give them a lot of discretion. And then along the way, they also have these values, which are up in the left corner here around judgment, communication, so forth. So here's a great example of not for everybody. When I teach the Netflix case study in my MBA class, probably about 70% of the students say, I could never work there, right? 30% say this is a great fit, right? Perfectly fine, right? Disney, you could say, well, there's a lot of people that love to work for Disney. A lot of people look at Disney and say, that's not really another place for me, right? That's all good stuff. So, it clearly reflects how the organization operates and what they think are going to succeed, which is to give people lots and lots of autonomy, the ability to be pivot and flexible, the ability to react quickly to what's unfolding in the marketplace, right? That's part of how we're going to succeed. They actually connect it to specific behaviors, as you can see, and they reward people based on those. And it's very choiceful. You want to see things where you can see the opposite of what they do as another example of an organization that could be a very good culture, right? It could be the exact opposite of kind of what they're doing. Okay, so let's take a look at a different one. Costco is, in some ways, Costco's an incredibly high-performing company, as you well know. It focuses on employee satisfaction and believes that employee satisfaction is absolutely critical. If we drive employee satisfaction, we're going to get customer satisfaction and we're going to get high performance. We're teamwork oriented, internal collaboration. We're very focused, very Drucker-like. We want to be focused on employee development and growth. We want to grow and develop employees, very nurturing, very learning environment. And we want to translate that into high levels of customer satisfaction and service quality, right? So, you look at this, this is really the exact opposite in many ways of Netflix, right? We're gonna tell you ways to develop. We're gonna help you development. We're gonna lead you in development. We're gonna have developmental programs. We're gonna have career tracking. We're gonna have ways of pathing, right? And so it's different. Is it good? Is it bad? Strong culture, right? It reflects how the company believes it will succeed in terms of doing things. So focus on employees. If we take care of employees, everything will take care of itself. We hire the right people, we train them, we develop them, they grow, we compensate them, everything will take care of itself, right? You want to promote employees that are passionate, have integrity, and take ownership. This is part of their overall values. We want to ensure customers that they can always trust they get the best possible deal. And we're placing bets on specific actions, right? That learning of employees and growth is going to translate into productivity on the part of the organization. There may be points of tension where we have employee development as the focal point, and there's some tension that may arise between employee satisfaction and customer satisfaction. We can deal with it and have those in open conversations. I think it's possible when you read these statements to say, I get a feel for what it would look like to work there. Same way you get a feel what it would look like to work for Netflix. You can argue that it's not closely tied to behaviors at this point, but it may not be that difficult for us to kind of make that happen. Okay. We're at 9:36 here on the West Coast. So I think we have time for one more example, which is PwC. And you see cultural elements: act with integrity, make a difference, care, work together, reimagine the possible. The reason we like this is that if you go below that, look below the line, you start to see very specific ways of behaviors that they're looking for, right? So imagine the possible. We want people to actually challenge status quo and try new things. We want people to innovate. We want to test. We want to learn from failure. We want to have an open mind about the possibility, right? That's kind of clear as to what the behaviors are that we're sort of looking for, right? Now, obviously for PwC, service orientation is very important. And if you take a look at things related to caring and making a difference, there's a lot here around service orientation. And that customer success will come from teamwork, working together, innovation, and really caring about each other to deliver against specific things. We have sort of, must-have cultural elements around integrity. This is obviously incredibly important at PwC, both on the consulting and the accounting side. But you can see it's a caring, inclusive, developmental sort of oriented culture, right? But at the same time, it may not be the right fit, for everybody, per our earlier conversation. So here's a score sheet for us to be thinking about in terms of culture, right? So our culture is based on a strong set of values, beliefs, norms, and rituals that shape the behavior of employees. We have a strong culture in the sense that everybody knows how things work around here. Our culture is a great fit for some people and a terrible fit for others. A 10 on this scale would be, we have a strong, positive organizational supports our strategy. Our culture enables our employees to imagine what we like to be employed by our organization. It's a perfect fit for some people and a terrible fit for others. Our culture is really the secret for our success. And that would be an 8, 9, 10. Okay. So that's kind of a simple little scoring, but it kind of gives you a feel for what we would be looking at in terms of kind of evaluating whether someone has a strong or weak organizational culture. Okay. So I'm going to pause here, Lynn, to see if we have any questions related to our flight through values and culture. I recognize we did this at a fairly good clip, but if this sounds good and it resonates for you, the chapters in the book give you a lot more detail around the criteria, and they give you a lot more examples of companies that we think are really good at having strong cultures and a strong set of values. And so the book gives you more detail behind it as to what is there. So I would encourage you.
Yeah, good. While we're waiting for people to type, I have a few questions.
Excellent. I love that, Lynn. Fire away.
The first one is, so there seems to be in the reality of this, a time element in establishing, for example, a change in culture, but even maybe just a change in values. And when it takes hold, or even if it takes hold at all, right? Can you speak to that? Like if we actually did want to make a change, how would that look? What would that look like?
Lynn, this is a really tough question because my answer is going to get people upset. And the answer is my observation, and this is Bernie, consultant versus Bernie academic reading literature. This is my in the field experiences of trying to drive cultural change in organizations, both now and when I was a full-time consultant for 10 years. These changes, oftentimes take place over a period of 7 to 10 years. And you might say, well, hey, Bernie, that doesn't really help me very much. The reality is that when you have organizations that promote and transfer people every 3 years or so on average, that means you have to go through 3 different people whose tenure was to drive this transformation. The probability of successful is less than 0. So that's not, okay, I'm exaggerating a bit here, Lynn. The point is this: when you have transformations that take that long, and you have people moving in and out of key positions that are trying to drive that transformation, it is incredibly difficult to get that to happen. And so I'd love to be able to say, yeah, we can make this change happen. Probably the best example of a large organization making a cultural transition over the last decade has been Microsoft. Microsoft had to move away from things that made them incredibly successful and to practice abandonment, getting rid of their desktop stuff, getting rid of a bunch of browsers, getting rid of a bunch of stuff that wasn't working, and moving. I never thought this would happen. Moving into the cloud, moving into AI, moving into a bunch of innovative things that they're doing with respect to their software as a service and working in the world of B2B as well as B2C. Man, I'm kind of shocked that an organization can do this. And way back in the 90s, Paul Mazzano was running IBM, and he wrote a book called something teaching elephants how to dance, something like that. I can't remember the exact title, but I'm not far away from that. And these are incredibly difficult things to do. If you're trying to drive cultural change, it has to be from the very top of the house, and it has to be committed, it has to be visible. You might say, well, Bernie, give me some concrete illustrations because it's fun to have you talk at a high level. Here's a really concrete illustration of a cultural change. Amgen, it's back in the 90s, I think, if I'm not mistaken in terms of the dates, took their head of R&D, who was a scientist, head of R&D, this was very serious, and transferred him over to be head of marketing. And he got into that position, and he said, because he was, of course, probably highly critical of marketing. What the hell is marketing? I'm a scientist, right? And he had no idea what the hell he was doing. And so he had to sit back and think, okay, I've got to work with imperfect information. There's no science behind marketing. I've got to make some judgment calls. I got to do this, I got to do that. But if you said to the Amgen organization, marketing is a critically important function within their organization, and we're going to take our most important asset and we're going to move that person over to be head of marketing. If you want marketing to be an important cultural element, to be the third leg of the stool of great R&D, great operations, and great go-to-market strategy, then a very visible way to do it is to take your best talent and rotate them through those particular functions, right? And you take the top of the house and make that happen. Wow, that's a signal that we're going to be doing something different here from a cultural perspective. And so, there are ways to accelerate the engine. I think Microsoft did that. So there are some case studies of examples of companies that did that, but it is really, really difficult to do. And I don't want people to have any idea that they can do this in 18 months to 2 years. It's just not going to happen. And people have to be committed to that, and that's the reality. Now, I guess now that I've said this, I'm biasing everything I just said towards these organizations with, 30, 40, 50, 100,000 employees. If you're an organization with 100 employees, I think you can make cultural change happen much more quickly. If the top of the house demands certain things and rewards certain things and kind of make sure that the top of the house is doing things, then you can drive change, in less than that time period. But I think the signal I want to give is, the longer the life of the organization and the more you've had time to develop these cultures, the more embedded they are and the more sticky they are and the more it's difficult to change them.
Yeah. So we have a couple of comments and then another question. Ron says, it's how true turnover definitely affects culture, and sometimes positively, sometimes not so much. And culture with a stable management team with low turnover is much easier to work with, for sure. And so he's got some history, and I reflect the same on mine. We had some very dramatic cultural changes at the very top of the house, which made a lot of people leave because they didn't fit the new culture. So I get that. Kelly wants to take us in another question here. So how best can we ensure unification of culture and values? For example, a site or a business unit of the company that behaves in a way that's less consistent with the stated values versus the corporate center. And you've got geographic, not only just that, but then you've got things in different countries with different cultures. How do you do that?
Yeah. By the way, that's not atypical. When these large global organizations, we have many regions and many functions and many areas, and you have matrix organizations and you get, blah, blah, blah. it's not atypical to find a area that's out of whack with respect to the overall organization. I think what has to happen is you have to do an intervention that is highly visible, that others look at it and say, why did they just do that in Thailand? What's going on here? And so you have to go in and you have to, number one is you need to be able to kind of be very clear about what the changes that you need, let's say in Thailand, and what are the things that we're expecting over the next 12 months. You typically need also in that world to probably remove some of the senior leaders of that particular company that somehow is responsible and accountable for what's going on there. You have to make that visible. And third is you have to communicate that broadly in the organization so people can see we're taking this very seriously. And so it's not easy to do, but I think you need to be able to kind of step in and make some transformation happen and make it highly visible. And oftentimes it's a combination of reward systems and doing something with senior leaders to change what's happening in the organization.
Thanks.
It's a good question.
So, okay, so I have another one now. And this one reflects, I think, where we as B2B marketers, we don't sit at the very, very top of the house typically, right? But we have influence, and maybe we can have some ability to influence and talk to the very, very top. But our customers in B2B, our customers, direct and maybe the next level, they really know who we are through our culture, because our people deliver either the service or they deliver a custom product. But typically our customers are very, very, very interactive with our employees more than in a B2C space. And so our brand is kind of delivered by our culture. So how does one keep their brand aligned with it? Because, if your culture isn't lined up with your brand, you look like you're lying, right? When you're out there.
Boy, Lynn, you are channeling Ralph Oliva right there. I can feel Ralph Oliva coming to life through Lynn. So even though Ralph is not with us today, I know he said he wouldn't be able to make it, and he's going to listen to what's going on here. He's going to have loved this portion. But on the other hand, he said that he had to wait 48 minutes for that question to arise. So at the 48-minute mark, Ralph, here's your question. Yeah. So the answer is there needs to be a perfect alignment between culture and brand. Perfect alignment. Mm-hmm. It's and this is where there needs to be an exercise around what does our brand stand for, and then what are our values doing to support that brand, and vice versa. What's our brand doing to support the values? And you need to kind of run that analysis. Now, what's interesting here is we can have poster child examples of great situations. Disney, their brand, and Disney, their values. Man, that's a really tight correspondence, right? On the other hand, there are some organizations where you say, okay, what does that brand stand for? And really the internal culture is not really aligned with what that brand might be meaning. So the client might feel, I'm getting this really caring set of people that are delivering this sort of caring, concerned, empathic way of delivering their professional services. But inside the professional services firm, it's incredible turmoil. And it's not a caring culture, it's cutthroat, right? That gets manifested at some point, in the brand, at some point, right? So you can't have this disconnect. Those customers are too sophisticated; they'll figure it out. And so, when you have that alignment between brand and culture, you're in great shape. And when there's a misalignment, there's evidence that there's things that are happening, and then there needs to be some sort of intervention. And whether that's data from the customer or whether that's data from internal, you can argue, but then you're going to need some sort of intervention to help solve that.
And so when I think about my own relationship with my previous company that underwent a significant culture shift for about 80 years, it was a family-run and very family-oriented organization that valued keeping people for an entire lifetime. For example, I was there all my life, and I have a pension, right? They were still offering pensions when everybody else was bailing out, because they valued keeping people employed and keeping their knowledge inside, and maybe to the detriment of some quality of the individual, but they kept people, right? When the family exited and the new company came in, of the new leadership, they they actually had a meeting that said there's a new compact we're going to have with our employees. No longer is it permanent employment forever. We want you to focus on your careers, and we will help you learn, but we want you to decide where you're going to go, and where you end up might not be here at the end. And that's okay, because you just need to be here when we need you here, and when you want to be here, and then you can go. And you can only imagine how that went over with the people that had been there for 25 or 30 years. And unfortunately, those are the folks that knew everything, right? Because literally there was not a lot of documented knowledge. It was all inside people's heads. So it was a horrible decade of change, where information got lost and people stopped working hard. And eventually it changed, though. Eventually it looked very different after all that time. But the brand delivery, the customers saw it. They didn't need to know that anything was announced on the inside, but the customers really saw that from the outside. And it's not that there was a reduction in sales or revenue, for example, or even profitability for that matter. But we had to go find new customers who didn't know us, because the old ones were a little skeptical, right? We lost old ones, got new ones, and yeah.
Really interesting, right? It's a
really
great story, right?
And so as a marketing person inside the organization, I was stressed out because I couldn't deliver the brand promise that we had articulated and made beautiful, right? The marketing folks on the team created a brand promise for the organization that we all believed in. And then behind us, it wasn't really happening, right? And we couldn't affect it. But it's the whole life cycle of the organization. So always interesting and fascinating. Okay, so we're going to open it one more time. We've got like another couple of minutes. If anybody wants to get in here and have a good time with this and share a story or two, if they're willing, we'll be happy to hear about it. I'll just give it another second. I just asking for it. Meanwhile, I'll remind you again that you can download this book to your Kindle and have it. I'm mostly saying that because we know people will come and watch this later. So there was a part 1, and now this part 2. And in part 3, we're going to talk about how we use this. And I'm going to be very interested in how we can affect change, because Bernie, you've said pretty clearly that if you're going to change things, it's got to come from top down. So
yeah, so this is really interesting. I'm going to tease people a little bit for the seminar 3 here, which is my belief at this point is mission, vision, purpose needs to be driven top down, unambiguously. But when you on a journey of realignment and reimagining culture and values, that needs to be an organization-wide initiative. So it's different processes when you think about transforming mission, vision, and purpose than when you think about transforming culture and values. So that's the primer, and that's the provocative statement to kind of kick us off for next time around when we talk about making change happen. So, Virginia and I will try and do our best to defend it. We've had the good fortune of working with a few organizations to do this, some large, some small, some nonprofits, some big ones. So we can share our little war stories of what works and what doesn't work based upon our small sample at this point. So, but it'll be some data around that. So we're looking forward to getting together with you in September. I know we're in July now, and so people are, heading into vacation mode, or should be heading into vacation mode at some point soon here. And so they're very much appreciate folks attending today, and would really love to see you next time around. If you think there's others in your organization that might benefit from this particular series, would love to have you invite others, friends, colleagues, and others. I have 4-legged animals running around here. I think they would be also someone who'd be interested in attending. They are attending right now. They've not really contributed that much today, which they have in the past. So I'm not quite sure if I was really as entertaining as I should have been, because they simply, I don't think I stimulated a lot of dog barking here today, which is typical. So, but are looking forward to seeing you in September.
Yes, and I think I'll reiterate again for the folks now and for those that are watching. This is a great opportunity to bring your team together and listen to something all together, and then take it back and have a conversation. Maybe you're not ready for a shift in any of these things, but the mission, vision, values, that ought to be reviewed every 3 years per our buddy Peter, right? So I don't know when it was last time, but it was during the pandemic that you would have done it last time, to be 3 years from now. So I'm thinking it's still a good time. Maybe everybody needs to just pick that up and do that for 2024. So this would be a good kickstart, right? So All right, great, everybody. Thank you so much for everything. And Lori, you can close that. Thank you, Ron. We'll see you in September as well. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.